In this edition of Art Rocks, fibre artists interpret the theme of metamorphosis.
When you ask somebody to go to a quilt show, they're thinking about grandmother's quilts, where we wanted them to come to see what the artist could do with art quilting.
A museum takes on the big issues through the language of art.
Does that make us more invested in the health of our air and the health of our environment?
We meet a poet who's bridging the gap between faraway places.
I feel as if I woke up from that life.
And the art of sculpting takes shape outdoors.
It's an extremely painful art form. It hurts.
It's all ahead on this edition of Art Rocks.
Art Rocks is made possible by the Foundation for Excellence in Louisiana Public Broadcasting and by viewers like you.
Hello, I'm James Fox Smith, publisher of Country Roads magazine, and this is Art Rocks. We begin our show today with a peek at the exhibit on display at the Bluebonnet Swamp Nature Center in Baton Rouge. Fibre artists from across the state are invited to quilt the swamp in this popular show, back this year after a short hiatus. The results, to the theme of metamorphosis, showcase the originality of the artists and the range of techniques applied in the textile arts. Let's take a look.
The Bluebonnet Swamp is a wild oasis in the city of Baton Rouge. Part of the city's park system, its boardwalks and nature center serve to educate school children and adults alike and provide a setting where nature can be appreciated. In the wet and dreary winter, artists are invited to quilt the swamp in an exhibit of textile arts. Inspired by the natural world, fiber artists from across South Louisiana bring a little color and light to the Nature Center during the darkest time of the year.
The reason we started it was to introduce the general public to art quilts. At the time, art quilts were not necessarily that well known, and the general population, when you ask somebody to go to a quilt show, they're thinking about grandmother's quilts, where we wanted them to come to see what the artist could do with art quilting. Most of the people who contribute quilts to the show are from the Contemporary Fiber Artists of Louisiana, and we used the initials CFAL, C-F-A-L. When we first started out with the Contemporary Fiber Artists, naturally most of us in the group were quilters. But we fast found out that there were other fiber artists working that would contribute to the group also. We have a lady here in Baton Rouge, Lucy Landry, who is a national doll maker. She shows her dolls all over the country. We have weavers in the group. We have people who spin their own wool to make their yarn. We have paper makers, papers made out of tree fibers, pulp, as well as cotton and silk fibers or whatever. We have felters working with wool, as well as quilters, just working with just the fabric in just a quilting manner. The theme for the show this year is metamorphosis. And the reason we came up with that name was here at the Swamp this year, they've been going through a lot of changes. They just opened a new education building. They're adding a lot of programs for the kids that come to the Swamp, as well as for the adults, for the general public, the tourists who come and tour the Swamp.
A reception for the artists gave us a chance to meet some of the participants and learn about their work.
Mostly I'm known for my dolls, but I do other things as well. I've been working in felt recently, and the three-dimensional felt is a very fun process. It's wet and it's messy, but it's malleable and you can shape things with your hands. I've been working a lot more with hand embroidery also lately. It's something I did as a child and moved away from as I started sewing with my sewing machine. I really like the embroidery that is on this. It's very subtle, and at the same time you can also have the embroidery that shows up and is very dominant. So you can use it to different effects.
I thread painted this piece. It started out as a watercolor. I scanned it into the computer and then printed it on fabric and heavily thread painted it through this area. I just love the idea of the thread and just the extra dimension that it gives me in my work.
I think the type of pieces I like to make are just very
Serendipitous is probably a good word, but just start with a beautiful piece of fabric with some great colors and just let it talk to me. This piece is one piece of fabric, and it looked like it had seeds and procreation type things, so I just went with that fabric. I was going to do something completely different, but when I laid them across each other to fit in this space, it became kind of a being of some kind. It's not really anybody or anything, and it's not really a flower or a butterfly. It's just something that grew from a seed.
The piece that I have has kind of been a work in progress for 10 years now. The original panels were 8.5 by 11, a page size, and they were meant to be a journal type fiber quilt. The first piece was done for a show, and it was strictly just a kind of a morphic looking butterfly, dragonfly, whatever you want to call it. After I finished that one, I went back and did the beginning of it, which was this piece here, was all the cells coming together, all the separate cells coming together to make one cell, and then that cell dividing, and then as the cells divide, they start forming the individual cells for the creature, and then eventually they come together and become this manic dragonfly with these brass tail weapons and the snout and whatever. So that's how the whole thing evolves. So it's actually been an evolution from piece one all the way up to the 5 pieces that it is now 10 years later.
For more on fibre arts in Louisiana, visit cfallart.blogspot.com. Now, let's take a look at some of the upcoming arts events happening across Louisiana. For more information on these events, visit our website at lpb.org/artrocks. And to find more arts activities, check out countryroadsmag.com. In our next segment, we stop by Philadelphia's Chemical Heritage Foundation, where artists have been invited to respond to the most severe environmental problems of our day. And while wrestling with these issues may seem inherently political, the featured creators have elected to use art, not rhetoric, to address them. Here's how.
In about 2000, I started making photographs seriously as art forms. Always used a camera because the nature of my work is the landscape, and I have to experience it. Monumental geological formations is what turns me on. Why? Well, I grew up in Brooklyn. So, what does a young, girl from Brooklyn want to see? She doesn't want to see asphalt. And being a visual person, I really got bitten by nature, looking at nature, experiencing it in any way I could. Since about 2006, I have another purpose, and that is to communicate some real issues about climate change. Climate change was in the air, global warming was in the air, and it must have been in the back of my mind. So I started revisiting all these images I used 30 years ago, and that got me on this path to think about climate change. I'm trying to straddle issues of data with issues of aesthetics. As a painter, I don't want to give that up. I'm not going to start going on the lecture circuit, and just show graphs and say, oh, look, there's the hockey stick, it's been like this and now it's like that. That's not going to do it. It has to be through my language as an artist. So I think what I mean by purpose is I have a new purpose for making my work. It's really also about examining, communicating, and telling the story in any way I can figure out how to do it.
Climate change was something often that was thought of as happening in a polar region. Elizabeth McDonnell and I did a lot of research. We had known of Diane's paintings of Arctic regions and then said, we want this show to have a local theme. I wonder what she has in that way. Taking the facts of the chemical history of a region and combining it with a first-person point of view, I think creates a kind of empathy in the viewer that says, oh wow, maybe I should care about this. Chemical Heritage Foundation is a museum, library, and center for scholars. We have a permanent collection of artifacts about the history of science, primarily the history of chemistry. We have a changing exhibits gallery, which is the gallery in which sensing change is now. How do I experience environmental change? Say, in some ways that are even joyful, right? Like smelling a plant. Suddenly, what's usually under your feet is at eye level. It's a kind of insect's eye view of the world. I'm no longer walking on the ground, but I am looking at it the way a worm would be crawling through it at that level. And a number of the works in this show offer a change of perspective. In Diane Burko's photographs, she is in a helicopter taking photographs of Glacier National Park, taking these photos of where glaciers are receding. The artists in this exhibit are making work about short-term as well as long-term environmental change. So that's everything from drought or extreme weather that's part of climate change to your daily rainfall. Stacey Levy's Calendar of Rain is a work that includes 13 months of rain bottles. Each day, we have been taking a bottle marked with the date of that day, and we put it outside our building and collect either air or rain, whatever may come that day. There's something almost sacred about bottling this water and staring at it. I mean, it's a simple act in a way. One of the artists, Roderick Hoover, is interested in and concerned about the toxicity levels in our watershed in the Delaware estuary. And so he looked at maps of exactly what kind of chemicals are at various locations. If the water is polluted, what's in the flood? When the waters rise, what happens?
Toxicity is a documentary film that combines clips and text to make a movie, so that every time you see the movie, it's different. The word for it is a database film. There are several lighthouses in this film. Of course, watching it once or twice, you might not see all the clips because it keeps offering variations. What's also unusual about Toxicity is that it's a very wide film because it's set across 3 screens instead of just one. And those 3 screens allow one to mix and match images to create unusual juxtapositions and to compare different sites.
And the walls did crack, and the water seeped through. And the water had a strange smell to it. It got worse and worse over time. There was a lot of flooding and a lot of mopping.
There is also a web resource called Chemical Map. And the Chemical Map lists over 200 sites of petrochemical production, brownfields, and EPA cleanup sites. Sort of the database out of which I drew the inspirations for the creative projects. I discovered that my childhood home in England was also likely to be flooded and erased by rising seawaters. And I was thinking at the time about what people lost during Hurricane Sandy. It made me think about the loss not just of the structures, but of personal memories, of your histories, the place you grew up. It's not just about scientific information. It's not just about data of pollution, contamination, changes in the landscape, but it's also the uprooting of people's lives and the changing of a landscape from a place we knew and spent our lives into something else, something we don't really quite know yet.
It's wonderful to be able to see something that's invisible and surrounds us all the time, and it's actually having an impact on us because these particulates are getting lodged in our lungs and in our hearts, and they could have negative health impacts. I'm presenting a large-scale public art projection piece called Particle Falls. It represents real-time particulate pollution as a transforming waterfall. We have a large-scale projection on the side of the Wilma Theater. It's a computer-generated waterfall that's cascading down the wall, and that waterfall transforms into a fireball dependent on the real-time particulate pollution that we detect. The instrument that we're using is called a nephelometer, and it sucks in air particles and then uses a laser to determine, laser scattering to determine the density of those particles at any one time. I'm not so interested in creating a bar graph or a very specific kind of graph that you can read, but I'm interested in creating an emotional reaction. That's why Particle Falls is interesting to me, because it's so large scale and it has such an impact on people when they see it.
Our city monitors air through the air management services. How many of us are attentive to that, know that, appreciate it? Can we work with an artist who cares about this and take the act of air monitoring and make it 30 feet high on a public building? Does that make us more invested in the health of our air and the health of our environment? That's, I think, where you get from excitement to perhaps responsibility and then action. The artist cannot do all of the steps in that process for us, but they can give us something compelling to experience to bring us there.
Next, we're exploring questions of national and cultural identity through the eyes of a purported outsider. Poet Dunya Mikhail, in 1994, escaped her home country of Iraq for fear of persecution. How has her life in America impacted her work? Here's her story.
Passport that's special that I kept, although it's expired, you know, but the reason that I'll always keep is that it's unique. It says that my profession is a poet. Although it's expired, I'll always keep it. It says here expired on May 19th, 94, and that's the time or the day I left my country, Baghdad. Being a poet, you don't need a leave of absence from anywhere. I started to think of myself as a poet first in high school, and then in the college I had my first book published, and that was in Baghdad. It was not my intention to make peace or to change the world. That was not my goal. I don't believe that poetry has these type of tasks. Before coming here, I always, write in Arabic. I don't even think about the translation or English. Then I realized this language issue, that you have this duality, not only duality of being, duality of existence, duality of memories, but duality of language. When you write a poem in your language, you write it one time. And when you think in the other language and try to write a poem in the other language, I feel as if it's a new poem. They say lost in translation, but also as things found in translation. I became American citizen in the year 2007, and I earned that hyphen. Now I became Iraqi-American. And contemplating, looking at that, I was thinking that hyphen, I always think of it. And it looks like a subtraction, but it's actually a plus. In reality, it adds to you. When people ask me, are you going to go back? I feel it's a strange question, as if I have to go back to a dream. And sometimes you feel like, was it you really that you were in that place? Did you see all that? Will I see what I know? Will I know what I see? I mean, it is really, I feel as if I woke up from that life. People say it's exile, they call it, but really this is for me, if I have to call it exile, then maybe I would say exile, sweet exile.
Time to explore another of Louisiana's treasures. This week we're visiting the River Road African American Museum.
From its beginnings on the grounds of Texcoco Plantation over 20 years ago, the River Road African American Museum has had an exemplary role in preserving the legacy of people of color in Louisiana. After a fire in 2002, the museum relocated to the historic district of downtown Donaldsonville. Its mission is to collect and preserve the artifacts, buildings, artwork, and stories related to the history and culture of African Americans in the rural communities between Baton Rouge and New Orleans. Founder and museum director Kathy Hambrick Jackson has conducted extensive research of the area, discovering historic buildings such as slave cabins and black schoolhouses, and connecting with the people in the region with first-hand stories to tell. The museum collection includes records of slave inventories, invaluable to those researching their genealogy. The scope extends to folk artists, black inventors, politicians, and the history of black education. Within the span of 300 years of history, the museum portrays the struggles and achievements of the enslaved and free people who contributed to our cultural heritage.
In our final segment, we're walking the warm shores of Daytona Beach, Florida, the playground and studio of a world-renowned sand sculptor. For more than 3 decades, this Florida artist has been shaping the shores around her into monumental works of art. Coming up, she reflects on the medium that has had an enormous impact on both her professional and her personal life.
In '81, I came to Daytona, and I saw a man doing sand sculptures all the time. And he and I ended up working at the same place. We became very good friends. And eventually he became my husband, but I learned from him. Mark was one of the first professional sand sculptors in the United States. He started in the late 60s. He was more prone to doing people, and I like animals a little better, and motorcycles and architecture lately. I like that. So it's strange what you find out that you do like. For 30 years I've been doing mostly soft sand. So it has more of an amateur look to it because you can't make it stand up tall. You have to use illusion to make things look as if they're standing free. And I love soft sand. For some things I really love soft sand. Although having worked now with compaction and tools, I've taken that, added it to the soft sand and changed it a little bit to where it's kind of a combination of both. It's a challenge because every sand is different. Every sand behaves differently. I mean, even sand that you might walk up and go, oh, I know this sand. Then you start working with it and it doesn't do the same thing. So it's that constant challenge. It's constantly trying, especially in soft sand, to find what gravity will allow. Mostly people watch when you're working, and it's horrible sometimes. Oh, because you figure an artist normally is hidden away. All of their mistakes can be dealt with privately. But you're just out there, whatever you're doing. And if you're doing it wrong, they're watching. But it's something about, you get right down to the level of the sand with your mind, and it's fascinating. It pulls you in. You can bring your imagination out into the world with sand. You can just create whatever you want. Sometimes, a lot of times, I'll just be sitting somewhere or something, and I kind of see the whole sculpture. All of a sudden, boom, there it is, Then I might work on it in my mind. Well, change this or add that. And you're always striving to make it better. It's never finished. And you're endlessly learning, endlessly. And I've done it 30 years now. In this country, we have about 40 professional sand sculptors. Worldwide, probably 300, because it's an extremely painful art form. It hurts. Your body hurts a lot, but it's worth it. You just have to keep doing it and keep after it. It takes a special kind of person to go through that pain and practice and practice and get to the point where they can create something beautiful. They go from tabletop, I do a lot of tabletop sculptures, miniatures, up to, oh wow, in Belgium we did, let's see, I think I had was a 40-foot octopus and a 250-foot dragon. And these are just massive projects. If you see it on television, if you see it in photographs or on the internet, it gives you no sense of the volume, and you just can never really see enough until you're a side of one, life-size.
And that wraps it up for this edition of Art Rocks. Remember, we're always available online at lpb.org/artrocks, where you can catch up on any episodes you've missed and find information on upcoming arts events throughout the state. Until next time, I'm James Fox Smith, and thanks for watching.